Welcome to the Denison Forum podcast. I'm Dr. Mark Turman, host of today's conversation, sitting down again with Dr. Jim Denison, cultural apologist and CEO of Denison Ministries. How you doing, Jim?
I'm doing well today, my friend. How are you?
Doing great. We are going on with our Summer Favorites series a little bit, and summer for many, if not all people, but for a lot of us, is all about travel. It's about vacation. It's about different rhythms. It's about in some ways meeting new people or reconnecting with people. So we both had some travel already. You're recently returned from Israel. Tell us anything you want us to know about. It wasn't exactly vacation for you, but you lead study tours to Israel on a consistent basis. You've been there more than 30 times. As I've often heard you say, every trip is unique. And what was unique about this one?
First of all, it's hot there.
Okay.
Who knew that it gets hot in Israel in June?
Right.
I mean, I should have known that, I suppose. So, it was a terrific experience. Had a great group that we were with there. We had a pastor and his wife that became very special to me while we were on the trip as well, and just developed some real terrific friendships that were part of the experience as well. At one particular place, we were actually at Capernaum, and someone had asked me, why don't the Jews trust Jesus as their Messiah? So I explained that there's a suffering servant and there's a conquering hero, and Jesus came as a suffering servant. When he comes back, he'll be conquering hero, but they want him to be the conquering hero. When they did then, the disciples said, aren't you now going to restore the kingdom to Israel? So even then they were wanting that. They thought Israel was the suffering servant, and they were expecting a conquering hero. So I was explaining all that, and that's why the Jews struggle with Jesus as Messiah. And the person that runs our tours, Dr. Mike Fanning, a longtime friend, 40 years, a brilliant guy, does all the details on our tours. When I made the point that the Jews were expecting Jesus to be a conquering hero, he made the point, so are we. That we too want Jesus to be less a suffering servant savior than a conquering hero, genie in the bottle, do what I want you to do when I want you to do it. That we're just as susceptible as the Jewish people are to that sort of wish fulfillment, transactional religion. And he's right. He's exactly right.
And kind of building on that, when we talk about being formed into the image of Christ, we want to be made like him. It's easy for us to then connect the dots to made like him as the conquering hero as opposed to the suffering servant.
Exactly.
We'd much rather be like him in that way as opposed to suffering as he did.
That's how health and wealth works, right? That's the appeal that, unfortunately, tragically, is so often made in the name of the gospel. And when Mike said that was my takeaway. Every time I go to Israel, God says something to me that's brand new and unique, I thought I hadn't had before, and that was the thought that resonates with me from then until today.
Yeah, it makes me think of the half verse that I like in Philippians, where Paul says, I want to know him and the fellowship of the resurrection, but then it's the fellowship of his suffering.
Right.
So I like half that verse.
Mm-hmm. Wish he'd stopped right there.
I wish he'd stopped right there.
That's right.
And so going places, and my wife's goal anywhere we go in terms of travel, her goal is one of two things, sometimes both. She wants to find somebody that she knows in that place.
Okay.
So the first time we went to Israel, she just kept looking around, going, I've got to bump into somebody here all the way around the other side of the world. I have to bump into somebody that I already know. So halfway through the trip, we're going up to Masada, which is a great place to go.
Except in June, by the way.
Yes. Which, if you're from Texas, Masada is the Israel equivalent to the Alamo.
Exactly.
Okay? And an incredible story in itself, right? Well, we're walking into the experience of Masada, and down comes the son of our youth minister that we had when we were teenagers, that she babysat this young man when he was a baby. And it just made her trip.
There you go.
Somebody like that she could find in Israel completely on a random basis.
So Judy is known to the world.
Yes. And so that's her first goal. The second goal is, can I meet somebody new that would be interesting, which is kind of a segue into what I want us to talk about in this Summer Favorite series, which is the reality of just how people really do impact and shape our lives in so many deep and profound ways, sometimes for bad, but hopefully most of the time for good. We talk around here a lot about what we talk about and talked about always at my church, which is We always talked at the beginning of a relationship with a new family in our church about the Great Confession, the Great Commitment, or the Great Commandment, and the Great Commission. We said that the Great Confession was to say in your heart and to believe that Jesus is Lord. That's that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, in Peter's words. That's the Great Confession. That's the moment of salvation. We would talk about that. We would talk about what you often talk about, which is the Great Commandment. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then Jesus' Great Commission to go and to make disciples of all the nations. Let's talk a little bit about the incarnational, personal reality of Christian faith. Let me look back to my own experience in Israel. First time I was in Israel, we got to the old city, and we were being led by a Jewish guide who was obviously not Christian, but also was not practicing in his Jewish faith. That was just his heritage.
It's a very typical thing in Israel.
And very wonderful man, very, very knowledgeable, but somebody asked him, why don't you believe in Jesus as Savior and Messiah? They believed in him, obviously, as a historical figure and claimed him very proudly in that way, but basically said God would never stoop to become one of us. He would. It was incomprehensible, the idea of the eternal, perfect, holy, and living God becoming a personal human being.
It is incomprehensible. Yeah, he's right.
And that is so much at the uniqueness. I can't remember the scholar who years ago said, if you can embrace the incarnation, the birth of Christ as God coming into the world, then you can accept everything else that goes with Christianity.
Sure. It all starts there.
Because that's one of the things about Christianity that is profound and unique.
Yeah.
And
staggering. C.S. Lewis said that if you want to get the hang of the incarnation, think of how you would like to be made into a slug or a crab. And he makes a point, you know?
And makes it pretty clear, I would say.
As he typically did.
Yeah. But just the idea, especially around the incarnation and around the Great Commandment, that the Bible teaches in so many profound ways that we are made for relationship, right? And so that kind of brings me to another reason that I wanted to have this conversation with you, which is we are primarily a digital ministry. We are trying to encourage and equip Christians to live biblically in the world that we find ourselves in, the culture that we find ourselves in. And we provide much of that through a digital mechanism. And that's something that our world is more and more accustomed to all the time. I'm significantly concerned about what it means to become what I would call a digital phantom. That we are a part of people's lives only through a screen or through the audio that they take in. And this personal incarnational reality is not something that you and I get to experience through this ministry in the way that we did when we pastored local churches and we were with people all the time. We see that in our culture, where we talk about people, one of the dangers of technology, your phone, your laptop, your screen, whatever the case might be, you can be in a room with people but not really with them. And you're not present in their lives, even though you're physically in the room. Technology takes you somewhere else.
We've all seen that.
And we've all
people
seen
sitting in the back seat texting each other.
Right.
Yes.
And we've all probably been guilty of it.
Probably so.
As well as victimized by it.
Keep talking. Let me check my email here while you're discussing. Yeah, exactly.
Excuse me while I look.
Yeah.
I'm listening while I look at my phone, and I'm taking in the news or my favorite drama series or a comedian, whatever the case might be. The ability to do that in our day is like none other. But life is about relationships. How could you have had the experience with Dr. Fanning if you had not been with him when he said what he said?
Sure.
And this idea that God didn't send a billboard, he didn't send a tweet, he sent himself. And the very personal nature, and I think our world's coming around to that.
I do too.
that we love technology. We're grateful for what technology is, but a lot of what we're experiencing in our world today is the recognition of the limits of technology.
Yeah, it's a means to an end at best.
Right.
Yeah, I think we're understanding that.
And people are experiencing that on a personal level at home. They're experiencing it on a work level. We have a big conversation in this new world on this side of the pandemic about work at home, being in a facility, those kinds of things. So people
churches are seeing this as well.
Yeah.
You know, yeah.
Big conversations in the church world about whether or not virtual worship is a thing.
Is it even worship?
Is it worship, and is it going to be permanent? And how do we understand all of that, right? So let's talk about people. Let's talk about people that have really impacted our lives. And I would tell people at my church on a regular basis, hey, be open to everybody, because the next person you meet could be your next best lifelong friend. The next person you meet could be the person that you want to travel the world with as an individual or as couples together. It could be that could be the person who will be standing with you when you take your last breath. It could be somebody you already know, but it could be the next person you meet. You never know. And that's the beauty and the power and the excitement of relationship. So we could talk a lot about the impact of our wives and of our parents, of our children, and of course our grandchildren.
Of course our grandchildren.
That would be a podcast.
That's right.
All of it to its own.
And it should be.
And it should be. But let's set those aside as special category.
Are you sure?
And let's talk about other
Have I mentioned
people.
my grandchildren before? Have I mentioned that I have 4 perfect grandchildren? Yes.
Yeah. What's the most perfect thing about them?
The fact that they're my grandchildren. You know.
Yes, and that's the great part about summer as well, is the things we
That's
get
right.
to
Spoil
do.
them and return them.
And just so I can kind of gig you a little bit, I am going to see my grandchildren next week.
As am I. So there.
Yeah, I guess we're equal on that.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about people that we have encountered. Could be as recent as yesterday. But people that we have encountered, and I want to break this down into 3 brief categories. And I guess my goal is twofold. One is I want us to be present with people. I think it's theologically, biblically sound. I think we've talked about it with different guests on our podcast, reweaving community and culture, and doing that right outside your front door. Sometimes inside your front door, but right outside your front door, that the biggest influence we can make as believers and to be salt and light is oftentimes right out our own front door with our neighbors, with our coworkers, with our friends, old and new. So let's talk about people that we may have encountered. And first category is somebody that you and I have encountered very briefly. Maybe one time we were with them, or maybe 2 times. But that encounter was significant in shaping us in some way. Have you had somebody that you've had that experience with?
Well, the first name that comes to mind is Billy Graham.
Okay.
So way back in the day, back in the early 2000s, I was on a steering group that came together to invite Billy Graham to come to the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex for what became the Metroplex mission with Billy Graham. And so there comes a time, long story short, where you actually make the presentation to him. We had 800 letters of invitation that we had gathered together. We've been working on this for a number of months. I got to be on the little group that flew out to Fresno, California, where he was preaching. He was doing a mission there in Bulldog Stadium, Fresno State. He had broken his foot the night before, getting up to change the thermostat. So when we came in, he was in the locker room at the base down in the stadium, in kind of a green room of sorts. He had his foot in a walking cast. It was up on the table. He had his notes in front of him, and he was sipping water when the 4 of us were ushered in to make the actual formal presentation. I was actually asked to lead the process of doing this. I obviously had never met Billy Graham before then. I'd been at stadium events with him. I'd seen him on television. I'd read his work. I was marvelously just so grateful, obviously, for who he was and what he was. I wasn't prepared for the intensity of the experience, for his eyes, and the holiness of that moment with him. And I know part of that I bring to the room expecting that. I mean, it is Billy Graham after all. But I wasn't coming thinking in those terms. When we walked in, he's frail, he was elderly, foot in the walking cast. We sat down, he was very gracious, he shook our hands, we all sat down. Then he fixed his attention on me as I started to make the presentation. And Mark, those eyes, those blue eyes, it was like he was seeing into my soul. And I sensed in his presence the presence of God in a way I don't believe I came expecting. His humility in that moment. After we made the presentation, he asked me, well, why did I believe that we needed to have this event? And so I thought he was asking, why did the Metroplex need an event like this? So I explained the lostness of our community and the numbers and all of that. He let me do that. And then he said, well, no, really my question is, why would someone of my age with my infirmities be effective in Dallas, do you think? Here's the person that has led more people to Christ than anyone in human history, asking if we thought he could actually be effective. That was the humility of his heart. He actually prayed for 6 weeks before he accepted our invitation. It turned out to be, at that point, the largest response numerically and financially they'd had in the United States. But the humility of his heart and the godliness, the holiness of his presence. It's the only time I was ever in his presence directly, and it marked me. That's been more than 20 years, and I remember it like it was yesterday.
Wow. And like you said, just to sense that holiness and that humility, all wrapped up just in that brief encounter. You just got to love that.
What about you?
I had an experience, a twofold experience. That was, the second part of it was actually renewed yesterday. That's how fresh this is. So I'm fresh in from California. Big meeting of our denomination that I was a part of, went out to, part of it was to meet people, was a primary purpose of going out there, and to meet some new people that we can hopefully do some things in ministry with, but also to reconnect with some people. But while I was there, I was just about to leave for the airport to come back yesterday, and was in a small reception room with a friend of mine. And this rather short, elderly, somewhat elderly man walked by, and he said, "You know who that is?" I said, "I didn't really pay attention." He said, "That's Jim Henry."
Oh.
The longtime pastor.
First Baptist Orlando.
First Baptist Orlando.
Yeah.
First time I met Jim Henry was 4 or 5 years ago. A mutual friend of ours put together a gathering of about 6 or 10 pastors. We would get together once a year and just talk about what it means to lead churches and what we were learning, what we were struggling with. It was therapy on multiple levels, but
no
also,
struggles, I'm sure.
No struggles at all. Pastoring's just a cakewalk all the time.
That's right.
But we would get together over spring, and so my friend who led this group knew Dr. Henry and had worked with him in past, and said to us, "Let's go to Florida, and we'll meet at the First Baptist Church of Orlando." And who doesn't want to go to Orlando? And
so sorry you had to do that.
I'll see if Jim Henry will spend some time with us. We happened to show up at a time when there was a large church growth conference going on at this church. So the campus was full of pastors.
Oh, sorry.
But we weren't a part of that.
Okay.
A couple of thousand church leaders in the sanctuary, learning and growing, having some amazing time. We were just in a small little room,
having your own conversation.
Having our own little small conversation, and spent the morning with Jim Henry.
Wow.
And I'm absolutely certain we did better than the guys that were in the big room, okay?
You absolutely. I don't know how you couldn't have.
But it was, when we met him, when I met him for the first time, he was in a season of his life where he was still preaching, but he had gone back to preaching Sunday morning at the original location of the church. In downtown Orlando, not at the campus that he had helped to construct, that we were meeting in. His wife was in a state of advanced illness and Alzheimer's, and he was her primary caregiver. And he talked a lot about what it meant to live out his vows in this season of his life, and the joy he had not only of caring for her in this journey, but also the joy of going back to the original location of the church and what that meant for him. So it was just this marvelous 5-hour experience of conversation where we just let him talk. We asked him questions about what it meant. And I had never known him except by reputation until that moment. And then when it was over, we broke for lunch. He left the room ahead of us, and then we stayed for a while, for a few minutes, to figure out what we were going to do for lunch. And the big conference was also breaking up for lunch at that time, and people were scattering all over the campus and eventually all over town. Well, we walked out, and Jim Henry was sitting on a bench in front of a small chapel that's also on the campus. And there are church leaders literally all moving all around him, and no one recognized who he was. And the 10 of us, as we walked by, we all took a mental snapshot that perhaps the greatest pastor in the country or in the state for sure is sitting right here by himself, and none of these younger church leaders recognize who's in their midst.
They've been meeting in a building he built.
In a building that he built. So anyway, so yesterday I'm in this meeting in California, about to come home, sitting in this small little reception room with no more than 6 or 8 people in the room, scattered all around having their own conversations. He walks in completely unannounced and unescorted. My friend says to me, "That's Jim Henry." And he spoke to him, and Jim Henry came over and engaged with us. We talked about that meeting 4 or 5 years ago. We talked about our mutual friend who's now in heaven. And when he walked away after being with us for a few minutes, my friend said, "You did notice the difference, right?" I said, "What was the difference?" He said, "Unlike a lot of people who were in that convention hall that we were in, who smile at you, come over, shake your hand, but their feet never stop moving, Jim Henry turned fully toward us, came and spoke to us, and was fully present with us. That's the difference." And I won't forget yesterday, and I haven't ever forgotten what happened 4 or 5 years ago when I first met him.
Well, I know we need to close this, and maybe we can pick up in the next one.
Yeah.
And talk about the more long-term relationships, and kind of maybe do a 2-part. We'll do a sequel here.
We'll do a sequel.
We're going to have a cliffhanger.
Yeah, we've already had Top Gun 2, so we might as well have a sequel to our podcast.
Top Gun 3, exactly. Yeah, let's see how that goes for us. But I love the fact of being present where you're present, you know? And the greater a person is, the more humble they are, in my experience. The old saying is, the closer you get to God, the further away you realize you are. And Jim Henry is at a place where he has nothing to prove to anybody, no place he has to be, and so he can be where God calls him to be.
Right.
And isn't that a model for us, you know? What a model at this point in his life to be able to be that present in that moment. And Billy Graham was that way with us. I mean, here he is getting ready to go up and preach in this stadium. He gave us as much time as we wanted. The folk that were running the schedule actually had to finally come in and end our meeting,
right?
You know, so that he could get ready for what he was going to go do next. But he just was so in that moment with us, with all of us, all 4 of us. He asked each of us our stories. He wanted to know our backgrounds. He wanted to know what we were doing in our lives and our ministries. And he turned to each of us as he turned to me. He locked on each of us, and he ministered to us in that moment. He was present to us in that moment in a way that made me realize, if the greatest evangelist in history can do that, why can't I do that?
Right.
Why am I too important? You know,
Yeah.
Sarah Hale, I guess, Battle Hymn of the Republic, author, if I have the story right, wrote to the president, whoever it was with whom she had a relationship, and mentioned to ask his help for some need that she was aware of. And he wrote back and said that as president, he was too busy to care about the needs of individuals. To which she wrote back and said, "Well, that's remarkable. Even God isn't that busy."
Wow.
Well, if God isn't that busy, and Billy Graham isn't that busy, and Jim Henry isn't that busy, maybe we're not that busy either. We just think we are.
Right. That's a good word. Reminds me, we're both C.S. Lewis fans, and reminds me of this quote that he is known for: "You've never met a mere human being."
That's right.
There's just no such thing.
That's right.
So be present where you're present. Be with the people that you're with. Technology is great. Distraction is real.
Yes.
Be Jim Henry. Turn your feet toward the people that God puts in front of you. It could be your next best lifelong friend,
Great.
And you could be theirs.
He had no idea we would be talking about him today.
Exactly.
Who knows who will be touched because of how he touched you
Right.
on the other side of this.
Yeah, which is perhaps a good closing challenge for us is today, if you're listening to this podcast, when you listen to this podcast, think about the people that you're with. Think about the people that you've been with today or that you will be with the rest of this day or this week or on your summer vacation. and look for ways under the Spirit of God to be fully present with them for how that might be redemptive both for you and for them.
You're there for a reason, aren't you?
You're there for a reason. Yep. Have a great day. Thank you for listening to our podcast. We'll see you again soon.